Today I'm going to share some of my favorite techniques about liquid watercolor with you as we paint a whimsical desert scene. I'll be using Ecoline. They come in separate glass jars, each with their own pipette. You'll want a mixing palette to keep the colors separate, and so you can adjust their intensity with water as needed. I like to put out a full well of color and in the well next to it a 50% diluted mix of water in each color. I'm using a limited palette of just 5 colors. If you'd like to paint along with me, the line art link and reference photo are below in the description box. Let's get started. First, I'll begin with a sketch and apply Frisket to mask off any areas I want to preserve as white. I'm using a silicone brush to apply it. The masking fluid ensures that these areas stay white as I work, and it's especially useful to preserve highlights when working with liquid watercolors because they are dye-based, which means that they tend to stain the paper and are more challenging to lift compared to traditional watercolors. You can skip this step and instead paint around the flowers, but it may be more challenging to get a smooth wash and preserve the intricate edges of those flowers. With the frisket fully dry, I'll start plugging in the background wash. I'm applying the liquid watercolor directly onto a pre-wet area of the sky using horizontal strokes and a large flat brush. If you pre-wet the area, the color you place will move within the wet surface as opposed to the dry areas that you've painted around with your initial water wash. The fluidity of the paint allows for covering large areas without leaving streaks or lines. It's one of the best qualities of liquid watercolor, as they allow for effortless, smooth washes. I put the full-strength violet at the top, and here I'm using water to pull it downwards. You'll see how after I plug in that initial background wash, I increase the angle under my sketchbook. This will help the colors flow downwards. The fluidity of the paint allows for tilting of the surface to create gradations in color. So the steeper the angle, the more dramatically the colors will move downwards, making for those seamless transitions in color. Keep your background wet as you plug in new sunset colors to ensure those soft blends. I avoid any areas where I want the sky to be yellow as I don't want the violet to blend in with that yellow. It'll make a muddy color by muting it if they mix together while wet. So notice how I use a combination of orange and pink for those transitional areas between the violet and the yellow. I like how it looks compositionally, but it also makes for a more complementary spectrum of color. While this area is still wet, you can manipulate it as much as you like by dropping in new color. Alternatively, you can wait for it to dry and glaze new color over top. I'm also going to plug in some really quick initial details in my foreground area with a smaller brush. You may notice that my paper in my sketchbook is buckling quite a bit. It's because it's only 90-pound paper and I haven't stretched it in any sort of way. So if you'd like to prevent buckling, either use a heavier paper or use tape around the edges to make sure it's nice and stretched. Next, I'll start working on the cactus in the foreground. I begin by applying the first wash of color to establish the midtones and shadows. I'm mostly using the violet but adding a touch of black to create shades. Liquid watercolor is highly saturated, but it can easily be diluted or mixed to create more muted shades. And it doesn't take a lot of product if you're going for a muted look, as you'll be adding a lot of water to your mix. See how I am not only doing a flat wash, but also taking care to establish some form in terms of those shadows and midtones. As I plug this in, I'd like to talk to you about why these paints are so highly saturated. It's because Ecoline and many other liquid watercolors are dye-based. It's important to know that due to this dye, these colors are not light-fast, meaning that they can fade over time if they're exposed to light. So they are really ideal for projects that can be scanned rather than for pieces that will be displayed long-term. Once that first pass of the foreground cacti is dry, I'll add a thin, darker glaze of color over the areas that need more shadow. I'm also adding a few silhouette cacti in the background using that same mixture. Notice how transparent they are, and how the sunset can almost be seen through them. Remember that watercolor will dry lighter, so if you're not sure if you need to add more color to make your mix darker, just wait for it to dry first. Now I'll remove the frisket with a pickup tool. You can also use your finger to remove it, though these are really handy for doing large areas. It's going to reveal the white areas that I masked off earlier with those really nice crisp edges. With that complete, I'm going to begin working on the flowers. I'll start by loosely plugging in the shadows on the petals and then charging them with wet mixes of magenta and violet or black and violet. Combining more water into the fluid consistency of the paint allows for a very loose style that can be charged easily. I also add a bit of extra warmth and establish the form of the flowers by focusing on adding some golden hues in the middle of each flower. It's a combination of yellow and orange. Liquid watercolors are perfect for creating those vibrant colors, and I use this to my advantage to make those flowers pop. I like to leave the flowers a bit less rendered and more painterly because I think that they look softer that way. I would always rather underwork than overwork flower petals, but that is just my personal preference. Once I'm done with this first pass, I will go back through with a darker mixture of violet and black to create a violet shade and plug in the darkest shadows I see on my reference for the flower petals. And while I finish up the flowers, I'd love to touch on the major difference between liquid watercolors and traditional watercolors, which is opacity. Traditional watercolors are available in a variety of different opacities, while liquid watercolors are always completely transparent. This makes them ideal for techniques such as glazing. Make sure that the layer beneath is completely dry before adding your next layer to take advantage of building depth without losing luminosity. Here I'm applying a glaze of yellow to the cactus in the foreground, which will optically mix with the purple tones underneath, creating a deep, beautiful green hue. See how that glaze gives us a rich look as opposed to if we just mixed a green? It also implies that the cactus is veiled in shadow, creating a harmonious environment. You can see that I'm really taking advantage of the transparent quality of these paints, and glazing is such an intuitive thing to do. Just make sure that layer beneath is fully dry, and then you'll be able to layer up your colors optically instead of mixing in the palette. At this point, I want to begin adding some opaque details for a more layered look. You can tint your liquid watercolors with acrylic, acrylic ink, gouache, or even an opaque watercolor. The gum Arabic binder in Ecoline makes them compatible with all of these mediums. While liquid watercolors are always completely transparent, you can mix them with a more opaque medium to achieve those solid layers. I tend to add this mixture in areas that I want to create more depth, that need extra definition, or a brighter highlight. I'll add very fine and loose thorns with the white and violet to give our foreground more texture, and another pass on the flowers with a bright white to give them a more layered look. I love adding another medium that has a little bit more body to it because these liquid watercolors really just sink into the surface. It's nice to be able to have something with a thicker viscosity. So when you mix your liquid watercolors with your acrylic, you're just toning your acrylic and you're getting a little bit of that 3D look to your artwork, but you're also getting a more opaque layer. So it's a really fun way to push and pull different shapes. And because this scene is very loosely based off a reference and for the most part completely imaginary, I think it's fun to lean more into the illustrative qualities of this painting and just having a little bit of fun with it and making it a mixed media project. You can also use the opaque white plus one of your colors to paint over an area that you're not happy with. Because these liquid watercolors are so transparent, you can't really cover up any mistakes, and they are a little bit harder to lift. So an easy workaround to that is to mix in a more opaque medium with it, and that way you'll be able to fully cover over things. So you'll notice how I kind of covered over some of that mountain area and just refine that a little bit more to my liking. Now I'm going to go back into the foreground and refine the details a little bit. The final step is to ensure that the entire painting feels cohesive with enough depth in the foreground to complement the background and the flowers. So that middle ground area is where I want to add just a little bit more detail to make everything make sense. Overall, liquid watercolors are made to layer. I love using the glazing technique to slowly build up depth, and the more opaque layers help create contrast against those bright colors below. It really creates these scenes that seem to glow from within. So they're perfect for things like sunsets, atmospheric scenes, or really any painting that you want to infuse extra mood and vibrancy. You can take your traditional watercolors and add a lot of water into them to make them liquid. However, there are a couple things you need to look for. Liquid watercolors will not granulate because they don't have any pigment, so you're always going to get those very smooth, even washes. Another thing is transparency. When selecting your color or pigment, make sure that it's very transparent as well to be able to take advantage of the glazing technique. Depending on how finely that pigment is milled may dictate how it actually separates and settles on your watercolor paper. This is not an issue with dye as it is completely liquid. I have one last tip for you before I say goodbye. If you have any leftover paint in its clean original state, you can actually use your pipette to put it back into the jar. I hope you enjoyed seeing these techniques in action and that you're feeling inspired to try them out in your own artwork. Liquid watercolors are such a unique and dynamic medium, and I think you'll really love experimenting with them. Thanks so much for watching and happy painting!